Well, Howard, welcome to our new series on the life of David. We're starting off at 1 Samuel 16 at verse 1 through to verse 13, and the reading will come up. And as we go through our series on David, we're really going to be focused on two things. Firstly, how God's people interact with God's message through David, and secondly, how this message is understood in light of the great King Jesus. So the reading will come up, and then we'll come back to the text. 1 Samuel 16, beginning at verse 1 through to the end of verse 13. This is where Samuel anoints David to be the king of Israel. The Lord said to Samuel, "How long will you mourn for Saul since I rejected him as king over Israel? Fill your horn with oil and be on your way. I am sending you to Jesse of Bethlehem. I have chosen one of his sons to be king." But Samuel said, "How can I go? If Saul hears about it, he will kill me." The Lord said, "Take a heifer with you and say, 'I have come to sacrifice to the Lord.' Invite Jesse to the sacrifice and I will show you what to do. You are to anoint for me the one I indicate." Samuel did what the Lord said. When he arrived at Bethlehem, the elders of the town trembled when they met him. They asked, "Do you come in peace?" Samuel replied, "Yes, in peace. I have come to sacrifice to the Lord. Consecrate yourselves and come to the sacrifice with me." Then he consecrated Jesse and his sons and invited them to the sacrifice. When they arrived, Samuel said, Eliab, and thought, "Surely the Lord's anointed stands here before the Lord." But the Lord said to Samuel, "Do not consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him." The Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. Then Jesse called Abinadab and had him pass in front of Samuel. But Samuel said, "The Lord has not chosen this one either." Jesse then had Shammah pass by. Samuel said, "Nor has the Lord chosen this one." Jesse had 7 of his sons pass before Samuel. But Samuel said to him, "The Lord has not chosen these." So he asked Jesse, "Are these all the sons you have?" "There is still the youngest," Jesse answered. "He is tending the sheep." Samuel said, "Send for him. We will not sit down until he arrives." So he sent for him and had him brought in. He was glowing with health and had a fine appearance and handsome features. Then the Lord said, "Rise and anoint him. This is the one." So Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the presence of his brothers. And from that day on, the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon David. Samuel then went to Ramah. Well, there are two main things I think it would be great for us just to look at for a minute or two in regards to 1 Samuel 16 verses 1 to 13. The first is just the sheer human nature of how God deals with his people. Saul had been the king prior to this and is still the king, anointed by Samuel. And when Samuel hears that God has removed Saul from the kingship and that is yet to take place, and then before that happens, he has to anoint a new king in David, Samuel gets very afraid. You can see that right up front. He's fearful. He's wallowing in his guilt and self-pity. He's chosen this guy to be the king, and he's done an absolute terrible job. And then when he hears he's going to anoint a new king, he's worried that Saul will catch wind of this and knock him off and kill him because it is a treasonous act. And so what we're seeing here, that it is better to trust God than wallow in our own self-fear and pity. Trusting God is what counts. And so Samuel, when he hears God's plan, understands and obeys. And that's where we go on to. And the next part of our story that has been a famous part of this story is what has become known as the Eliab syndrome. That is Eliab, after the eldest son of Jesse. And the Eliab syndrome, as opposed to God's will and plan, is when we look at people from the eyes of humanity, of what is good from our own viewpoint. Now, the Olympics have just been on and conclude, and that is a great example of the Eliab syndrome, where we see winners and losers based upon skill and effort. And that is exactly what we have here in 1 Samuel 16. We see people's judgments being made on how good a person looks by how much skill they appear to have. And so when Samuel comes and he sees Eliab here, he goes, "Oh, this guy is awesome. Look how handsome he is, look how high he is, look how fast and strong he looks. This guy will make a great king." And we often think this in society, don't we? We choose people based on charisma, based on personality and skill, not based upon God's will or godliness. And this is exactly what we see in our text today. In fact, old Samuel has to go through all the 7 kids before David, before he realizes that God has a different person marked out entirely. But one thing I hadn't noticed greatly is the contrast between verse 7 here and then when we get to David in verse 12. Let me read verse 7 and then verse 12 and see if you can grasp, well, how does David fit into this Eliab syndrome? Verse 7, "But the Lord said to Samuel, do not consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him. The Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart." In other words, it didn't matter how impressive he looked, it's what mattered in his heart that counted. It's what type of person you are, what type of character you have, especially is your character from God or not. But verse 12, David rocks in, he's out there caring for the sheep because he's the youngest and no one considered him worthy to be considered the king. But verse 12 seems to be a throwback to that Eliab syndrome. So he sent for him, that's as David, and had him brought in. He was glowing with health and had a fine appearance and handsome features. So it seems that, David wasn't but ugly or, a small little runt. David himself was a man who of fine appearance. He did represent what we look for in people. Strong, courageous, healthy, handsome. But David is not chosen because of those actual features. He is chosen because of what we have back in verse 7. That God looked at his heart. It didn't matter what he looked like. It didn't matter how strong physically he was. It didn't matter whether he was handsome or attractive or not. What mattered was he able to bend his will to the will of God. This is what matters. And the Lord said, "Rise, anoint him. He is the one." Now, on one surface, this can seem great news because we all wish we could be chosen by our character, not by the looks that we see in front of us. And if you go to Instagram profiles or Facebook or watch most TV shows, it seems that you would need to be a runway model to classify yourself as a worthy human being these days. And the Lord's saying, no, that's not right. It's what is in the heart that counts. But on the surface, whilst this seems a good thing, inevitably we know that this condemns us still because of the words of verse 7. The Lord does not look at the things of outward appearance, but the things of the heart. And we go, but I can't be chosen by that means either. And the reason is because it's not that we are like David. It's because Jesus is better than David. If you're choosing people by basis of how their hearts are in line with God, then only Jesus satisfies this David requirement here. Now, only Jesus ultimately is a man after God's own heart. Only Jesus can be chosen according to outward appearance and inward appearance. Outwardly, he does the things of God because inwardly he is God in the flesh. And that's why it's good. It's not that we become like David's. It's that Jesus is the better version of David, the ultimate king, the great king to be chosen. And this will set the story forward as we go through, especially when we come to David and Goliath over the next couple of days together.